We've got a bit of a rainy day here happening. We were going to get inside a hive and take a look at the bees doing their amazing work, but today it's a little bit rainy. We did attempt to open a hive earlier and they weren't very happy about it. Bees really like a warm sunny day, mid-morning to mid-afternoon, and that's when they're more calm if you're inspecting their hive. So today we're going to discuss the different types of brood frames. We often get asked what type is best. So we're going to go into it, look at the pros and cons of the different types of brood frames, and if you've got questions, put them in the comments below. Also let us know if you're a beekeeper and you have a preference, what you like about your brood frames and what type they are. So put them in the comments below. Also remember to put your questions in and we'll answer them. So what type of brood frame is best? Now, beekeepers have all different preferences and all different reasons why, and it actually really depends what works for you and your bees. So let's just discuss the different types and we'll take it from there. We've got a lot of rain, so sorry about the noise on the roof. I'll try and speak up a bit. Let us know if you can't hear me. So shortly after Langstroth invented the movable comb hive, a guy by the name of Johannes Mering from Germany invented wax foundation. And it was a bit of a leap forward because it provided a structure for the bees to draw their comb on and allowed the frames then to be put into a centrifuge because the comb had these supporting wires running through it. So we'll discuss the benefits of wax and wire foundation first, and also some cons. So what this basically is a wooden brood frame. You come along with wire and thread it through these little eyelets back to the other end and eventually nail it off, trying to get it nice and tight. You need to build a little jig to do that. Then you come along with a sheet of wax foundation, which is basically wax that's been collected from commercial apiaries and then pressed and rolled into this foundation pattern which the bees will then draw their comb out from. Now, it's a little bit of work. You do need to thread all this wire through. You need to melt the wires into the wax foundation using usually a 12-volt power supply connecting to each end of the wire. You can use a car battery if you like, and it can be a bit of fun, but I used to do it for years and years and years, and I am now so glad I don't have to do that anymore because it's quite tedious, time-consuming work in producing your wax and wired frames. I hope you can hear me. The rain's really coming down. Another benefit is you can cut out wax honeycomb from a frame like this. There is the wires, so you have to be careful, and you're running your knife along the edge of the wires and cutting out sections of wax honeycomb which you can serve on a plate. So that is wax and wire foundation. Now, later on, people started using a synthetic foundation or a plastic foundation. Now this is typically made by ABS plastic, which is a plastic that isn't known for being very, while it can be food safe, it's not known to be the best choice in a hive. Nevertheless, it is something that is used a lot today. Plastic foundation. It's a bit easier to install. You simply, as you put your frame together, you can slot it into the top and bottom slot and nail your frame together, and then you have a wax foundation. Now, it's nice and strong and robust. It lasts a long time. You don't need to keep replacing it with wax foundation, but you can't cut honeycomb out of it because you don't want to chew on the plastic, and also the bees don't tend to favour a plastic foundation as much. You probably can't hear me at all, but let me know if you can hear me. Okay, people can still hear me, great. So I find the preferences of bees go naturally drawn comb, where they've got an empty space, they'll fill that first, followed by the wax foundation sheet, followed by the plastic foundation. Now that's, I'm talking in the brood box. Can be quite hard to get the bees to build their comb on this. Often they'll build brace comb straight crossways. So what beekeepers tend to do is either put it on a really heavy flow, which gets them building more quickly, or they can coat this in wax by painting melted wax on here, or rubbing wax on and leaving it in the sun for the wax to melt into the surface, which makes it a little bit more appetizing for the bees and more likelihood of them getting going straight away. The next is, actually here's another variation. So this is a plastic foundation with a plastic surrounds as well. So I've used a lot of these in the past when I was doing more conventional apiary. I now no longer like these. I much prefer to keep things perfectly natural in the brood box using a comb guide like this. So this is a frame that we supply with our hives. It's built to accommodate plastic foundation, wax and wire foundation, or naturally drawn comb. So it's up to you, and feel free to mix it up in the box and find out what works for you. The benefits of naturally drawn is there's no wax and wire, there's no plastic foundation to install. The bees simply hang their comb from this comb guide. So you see this beautiful work of the bees hanging their comb, and it really is a marvel to watch. They can perfectly size the cells for themselves, which studies are starting to show there's a health benefit in that, because the bees can then make their cell size perfect for their brood, and what usually tends to happen is they regress a little bit to a smaller, more naturally sized cell. What happened when foundation was invented was a concept of making the cell size a little bit bigger, and this is typically 5.3 millimeter foundation, which makes the bees a little bit bigger, and the idea was they might be able to fly further and faster and collect more honey. Letting them build their own cell size allows them to match it perfectly, and also some people are finding it helps with varroa mite, because the bees, being in a slightly smaller cell, hatch slightly earlier and beat the varroa mite out into the hive. Now that's there's lots of different opinions, so that's just one of the opinions out there. If you're collecting honeycomb, naturally drawn comb is perfect. You can get a great big piece to put on your cheese platter, and there's no wires to cut through, and you get this beautiful honeycomb coming out. Another, what I consider to be a major benefit, is you don't need to introduce foreign wax to your hive. Studies are now starting to show that when you use wax foundation, that foundation has done a number of cycles around in beehives, in commercial apiaries, and can contain a high chemical load of miticides and also pesticides from the environment as it builds up in the wax. So I now prefer this, although many times there's a mixture in the hive due to taking a split from another hive or buying a nuke. So it doesn't really matter if there's a mix in your hive, but I do like naturally drawn comb because it's so simple and it keeps it natural for the bees. However, there are some cons involved. The bees may decide to build sideways. If you've got a foundation sheet, they can't build sideways. Actually, they can still build sideways, but they're less likely. I find on these ones the bees do often build sideways actually on the plastic foundation because they're trying to avoid it, but they can't actually go right across a number of frames. So they do take a little bit more management. So in your hive, what you'll need to do is first of all make sure your frames are pressed tightly together, so the spacing is perfect for the bees. Now, the bees typically like a spacing of 32 to 35 millimeters between the comb centers. Now, conventionally frames are built to sort of be in between brood comb and and in between brood comb and the super or honeycomb. So that's why they're spaced at 35. 32 millimeters is actually more exactly the point at which they like to draw the natural comb. If you want to muck around, shave a little bit off these edges, bring it into 32 millimeters, and you might find they build even straighter natural comb from these guides. So the management is, especially if you've installed a colony and there's a whole brood box full of naturally drawn combs, then you're counting on the bees really sticking to these comb guides and drawing their comb down. Now, you'll need to get in there and have a look, because when they're building it, if they start to go sideways, then they'll continue to go sideways, and you could end up with a whole box full of sideways comb, which is a complete mess. It's really hard to service. You'll need to go through a process of then cutting that off and either rubber banding or putting skewers through the side here to hold those bits in place, and it's a bit of work to fix it up. So you're much better off taking a good look, enjoying the process of watching the bees build on the combs and making sure they're nice and straight to start with. Once they get it straight, then they will follow suit. Another issue that can go wrong with naturally drawn combs is if you try and get it happening in a super. So bees typically, if you add a super on top of a brood nest which is already full, they will come up and start building comb from the bottom up. So you can see what might happen here. They start here and start to build from the bottom up. You start getting all this wonky comb and not a straight comb from this guide. So if you are doing naturally drawn comb in a super, then you'll need to give it some guides. So if it's up against the wall of the hive, they can use that as a guide, or if it's up against another frame, they can use that as a guide, and they're much more likely to go straight. And that's another technique, even in the brood box. If you are placing a new naturally drawn comb and you've got some honey frames on the edge of your nuke you're installing, you could place it just inside, so you've got your naturally drawn comb in between a nice straight brood honey frame and a brood frame, and then they've got guides to draw it straight, and you don't have to go through that process of inspecting the comb to see whether it's nice and straight. So it doesn't matter which one you use, work out what works for you. You can mix it up, and they're all the pros and cons I can think of. If you've got questions, put them in the comments below and I'll get to answering them.
Bradley asks, is one brood box full of bees enough to fill the flow frames, or do you recommend a few brood boxes to strengthen the hive capabilities of producing honey?
Okay, 1 or 2 brood boxes. That's a common question we get. So I would recommend starting with a single brood box and our flow super on top. Reason being is they'll be much quicker in filling that flow super, and you'll get less impatient waiting for the bees to fill the frames. However, in some cold climates, beekeepers will really recommend that you have 2 brood boxes, so that there's a lot of honey stores in the brood boxes also to survive the winter. Now, if you want to, and it's a bit slower, you could spend the majority of the first season building up those 2 brood boxes, and you do run the risk of missing that next season, and having to wait till the next one to fill your flow super. Alternatively, you can go, once they've filled the brood box, super on top, let them get started, let them storing honey, and then you could add another brood box if you want to. Around here, people typically just go 1 brood box and either 1 or 2 honey supers. Tends to be the general trend.
Margaret asks, is there any concern of wax foundation introducing diseases such as AFF to your hive, main aphid?
So the question is, introducing foreign wax, does it introduce the potential pathogens to your hive? And my answer would be possibly. Foundation makers do go through a process of sterilising their wax, and they should. However, you are introducing foreign wax to your hive, so you never know whether your foundation maker did a really thorough job of sterilising the wax. Now, there's a few sterilisation methods. One is heat for a long time, so they keep it in that molten phase for a long time, and the other one is irradiation. If they used irradiation, there's very little chance of there being AFB spores in the wax. So generally I say there's a pretty low risk of having AFB spores in wax foundation.
Tom asks, is wax or plastic a better foundation?
The bees I find prefer, if you're going to add a foundation, the bees I find prefer a wax foundation. They're much quicker to build on it. Yeah. Using plastic foundation does take some knowing about the weather and what's happening with your bees and what's happening with the environment around. Typically beekeepers won't install a lot of plastic foundation unless there's a really strong honey flow and a lot of bees in the hive, because until then they tend to be a little bit standoffish. So if you're starting out and you want to use foundation, then wax and wire is probably the way to go. And when you get sick of waxing and wiring, you can try the naturally drawn comb, simply with the comb guide.
Asti asks, what do you do if you notice that the bees are starting to build sideways comb? Do you cut it off?
So if the bees are building sideways comb, you come along with your hive tool. Now if they were building along here nice and straight, and then they just started to curve off here, you could simply get your hive tool and push it across. The wax is quite malleable. The bees will then reconnect it. Now that's the perfect time to catch it if it's going sideways. If you've left it too late and the bees have really gone sideways and they've gone right across to the adjacent comb and started to connect it there, then you will need to go through a process of fixing that, which may involve cutting the straight bits of comb out and either securing them into the frame with rubber bands, or you could also use skewers poked through these little holes to pin the pieces of comb in the frame for them to then have another go at starting nice and straight.
Shane says, I had 2 brood boxes and the bees started to build comb from the bottom up. Would putting vertical strips of wax foundation help?
Okay, so there was that question about supering with naturally drawn combs. So if you come along, put another brood box on top of this, fill it full of naturally drawn combs, typically what happens is a big mess. You'll get the bees starting from the bottom and going all wonky, and a better thing would be, if you really want to do a second box of naturally drawn comb, would be to move half of the frames up from the bottom and checkerboard it. So then the next lot of frames have a guide. So they've got a frame here that's built, a frame here that's built, and then they're more likely to go straight in here because there's a nice space in between these 2 frames. If they have gone wonky, then you'll have to go through a process of refixing that. Another idea would be to move all the frames from here up to the top box, or simply what's called under supering. So you lift this box up and put the new super below. So that's common in the type of beekeeping called warre beekeeping, where you always put the new box down below and let the bees naturally draw their comb in the lower box. So a few options there if you want to naturally draw 2 boxes full of brood. More questions?
Bradley says, when using natural comb, do you just fill the brood box with empty frames and add the bees from a package right into it?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've done that many times, and if you're adding a package, then what you'll need to do is make sure these frames are pressed nice and tight together. So if you have a look here, so adding a package, for those who don't know, that's an artificial swarm. So there's no frames already. A nucleus, if you purchase a nucleus, it will come with frames that are already built out with a functioning hive and brood on them and nice straight combs. If you buy a package, or if you catch a swarm, you'll be shaking those bees right on top of your frames here, and hoping that they build it nice and straight. Now, tips to getting them to build straight is make sure the frames are pressed tightly together. So if you've forgotten to do that, go in as quickly as you can and push the frames together, and come back in a couple of days and just check that they're starting to build on the comb guides. If they're not on the comb guides, use your Hive tool to push it across and make sure it's sitting in the center of the frame. If you don't do that, you'll end up with a big mess. So naturally drawn comb is a little bit more work in the Hive when you're starting out, but less work in installing the wax and the wires.
Jason says, I was gifted 3 brood frames with a queen that are only about 3/4 size deep. What's the best process to eventually replace the 3/4 frames with the full size frames I got with the Flow Hive?
Okay, so there is different size brood frames, and changing from one to the other can be a little bit tricky, but there is ways you can do it. So let's say if you've got 3/4 size, so your brood frame's basically this size here. Now, what the question is, how do you go from that to a deep brood box like this? So there's a few different options. One is you can under super with your deep, so put your 3/4 box right on top of this and let the bees naturally go down and start building brood frames that are deep in size in your bottom box. After a while, you could then, as the bees tend to keep their brood lower down, you might find there's an opportune time when there's only honey in your 3/4 size box, and you can then take that box away if you wish, or you could leave it there. If you don't have a 3/4 size box and you're just gifted the frames in a nucleus style container, then there's a few things you could do. You could simply put the frames in and checkerboard them. So you might have a 3/4 size frame here, and then a deep frame here, 3/4 size frame here, deep frame here, and it will get a little bit messy. The bees will then start building comb hanging off the bottom of your 3/4 size frame, which is not ideal. But what will also happen is they'll start building on your deep frame next to it, and you can go through a process of then cycling out the 3/4 size frames with the naturally drawn comb hanging off the bottom. You can slowly move it to the edge of the hive and cycle it out, eat the honeycomb. Bees tend to put the honeycomb on the edge, so edge frames you can often take right out of the hive, and your family can have a chew on the honeycomb. It's often quite dark honeycomb because the bees have used it for their brood, but can be a sweet treat nonetheless. So there's a few options if you're trying to go from a shallow or 3/4 size frame to a deep size frame. I'm sure there's other methods. If anyone's got a better method for doing that, put it in the comments below. More questions?
Peter Cox, who is a Flow ambassador in Adelaide, he says, I have 2 hives that have 2 brood boxes under the Flow Super. I'm finding that they store a lot of honey in the middle brood boxes and not putting all of the honey into the Flow Super. This means that we are not getting the maximum yield from the hive. I'm planning to split the hives and turn them back into a single brood box under the super in spring. Any comments?
Great, Peter. Fantastic. Thanks a lot for doing your great work. Now, I think you're right. It does slow things down if you have 2 brood boxes and then the flow frames on top. I would recommend at least starting with a single brood box and then putting your Flow Super straight on top of that. You get much quicker action on your flow frames. Once the flow frames are really built out and all covered in wax, then you can go back and introduce your second brood box. Typically your second brood box in our area, in Australia here, ends up full of honey anyway. So what you're doing really is collecting a box of conventional honey frames, which you'll then need to go through the process of spinning. If you don't have a spinner, you could crush and strain or cut honeycomb out of it. But I do find that one brood box actually has plenty of brood to service your hive. So if you count up all the cells, there actually is enough room in a brood box to keep a hive of 60,000 bees strong. Good question. Okay, thank you very much for watching. Today we're covering the different types of brood frames. If you're just tuning in, we have the naturally drawn comb, which has pros and cons. It is my favourite because you're not introducing new wax to the hive. You're letting the bees perfectly size it for themselves. And if you wish to get some honeycomb from the edge of the hive, you can simply cut out the comb. If you're using a foundation sheet, conventionally this was invented in 1857 by Johannes Meringue in Germany, who invented this method of rolling the wax into a foundation sheet. Wax and wire is the way to go. I've done lots of it in my life. I'm glad I don't have to do that anymore because it's quite tedious, but the bees seem to quite like it. They do build on it quite quickly. The preference would be for the bees to go naturally drawn, then a wax foundation followed by a plastic foundation. Plastic foundation is a newer invention compared. Lots of beekeepers do like it because of the simplicity. You don't have to wax and wire. It's nice and robust for spinning. We're not putting our frames in a centrifuge, so there's no need for me to have really robust foundations in the frames. Thanks a lot for all your great questions, and tune in again next week, and hopefully we'll get a fine day of weather and we can get into the hive and have a look at what the bees are doing.